Venice. If you picture gondolas, moonlit canals, and romance, you're dead wrong. Back in the 18th century, this glittering city wasn't a lover's paradise. It was a ruthless, paranoid police state ruled from the shadows by an untouchable syndicate known as the Council of Ten. Imagine waking up in the dead of night, dragged from your bed by silent enforcers, and thrown into a pitch-black cell where the air is so thick you can actually taste the rot. You don't get a lawyer, you don't get a trial, and you sure as hell don't get a release date. You are simply erased from the face of the earth, buried alive in a suffocating box right beneath the scorching roof of a palace that mocks your suffering. This isn't a nightmare. This is the Piombi, the most inescapable black site prison in history, and the stage for a breakout so psychologically unhinged and physically impossible, it still leaves modern investigators scratching their heads. If you're listening to this late at night and feeling those chills creeping down your spine, do me a favor, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what part of this absolute nightmare scares you the most. To understand the sheer magnitude of this escape, you have to forget everything you think you know about Giacomo Casanova. Today, his name is a cheap punchline for a guy who smooth talks his way into bedrooms. But in 1755, Casanova was something far more dangerous. He was a hustler, a grifter, a dangerously charismatic intellectual who dabbled in the occult and possessed a silver tongue that made the authorities extremely nervous. In a city swarming with informants, a guy like Casanova was a walking target. The feds of the Venetian Republic, the state inquisitors, were watching his every move. They didn't just want him quiet, they wanted him gone. The hammer dropped in the early, mist-choked hours of July 25th, 1755. It was just before dawn, the kind of quiet where every floorboard creak sounds like a gunshot. Casanova was asleep when the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots echoed up the stairwell. Messer Grande, the terrifying chief of the secret police, kicked in the door with a heavily armed squad. There was no reading of rights, no dramatic shootout, just the cold, brutal efficiency of a state snatching a man out of his own life. They tore his room apart, confiscated his papers, and marched him out into the damp Venetian fog. He was hauled across the Bridge of Sighs, a limestone bridge where the condemned caught their final glimpse of the lagoon before descending into darkness. But Casanova wasn't going down into the damp dungeons. The Inquisition had something far more sinister in mind. They were taking him up. Deep inside the sprawling Doge's palace, past the gold-leaf ceilings where the elite sipped wine, lay a twisting stone staircase leading straight into the attic. This was the Piombi, the leads. It wasn't just a prison. It was a medieval torture device disguised as architecture. The roof of the palace was covered entirely in massive, heavy plates of solid lead. Beneath these slabs were cramped, claustrophobic wooden cells. If you were locked down here, you weren't just serving time, you were enduring a slow execution by the elements. During the brutal summers, the sun beat down on the lead roof, turning the cells into literal ovens. The heat was so intense it would peel the skin off a man's back, cooking prisoners alive as they suffocated in their own sweat. In the winter, the lead acted like a freezer box, trapping coastal winds and turning the damp air into a bone-chilling icebox. When the heavy iron door slammed shut behind Casanova, the finality hit him like a physical blow. The sound of that lock turning haunts every inmate, but for him, it was the sound of a tomb sealing. He was locked in a cell so low he couldn't stand up straight. The only light came from a tiny grate facing a dark corridor. No bed, no chair. Just a filthy bucket and the crushing weight of silence. The psychological toll was devastating. Solitary confinement is known to destroy the human brain, but the Piombi had no rules. Casanova was entirely cut off from the outside world. He didn't know his charges or his sentence. For all he knew, his file was burned, and he was expected to rot under the lead roof until his body gave out. The guards were strictly forbidden from speaking to him. The only sound he heard was the rhythmic chiming of the clock tower outside, a mocking reminder of time passing. Tick, tock. Every chime was another hour stolen. Most men break under that pressure. They go insane, smash their heads against the oak doors, or simply let the darkness take them. For the first few weeks, Casanova was right on that razor's edge. The isolation was eating him alive. He suffered crippling panic attacks and physical deterioration from the foul air. The feds designed this place to break the human spirit, to strip away hope until only a hollow shell remained. He was thrown into an inescapable black hole. Nobody had ever broken out of the Piombi. The odds were impossible. But the Inquisition made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot who they were dealing with. They thought they had locked away a superstitious poet. They didn't realize they had caged one of the most relentlessly stubborn, manipulative men of the century. As the searing summer heat gave way to the creeping chill of autumn, the panic in Casanova's eyes faded. It was replaced by something cold, something calculated. If the state wasn't going to give him a release date, he would forge one himself. He began studying the shadows. He memorized the exact timing of the guards' footsteps. He analyzed the thick wooden planks of the floor and the iron-reinforced walls of his tiny box. He had no shank, no contraband, and no crew waiting on the outside. All he had was a desperate will to live and a mind that refused to break. The greatest jailbreak in history was about to begin. But to pull it off, Casanova wouldn't just need luck. He was going to need a weapon. There's a specific kind of madness that sets in when you are buried alive. It's not a sudden snap, it's a slow, agonizing descent. The silence in the Piombi was absolute, broken only by the muffled sounds of guards dragging chains or the distant, mocking toll of the St. Mark's clock tower. Every chime was a sledgehammer against Casanova's sanity. He was trapped in a wooden box, hunched over, breathing in the stench of his own waste, completely disconnected from humanity. The state wanted him broken. They wanted him to beg. For months, it seemed like they were succeeding. He was fighting vicious fevers, hallucinating in the suffocating heat, pacing like a caged animal until his knees gave out. But a desperate man is a dangerous man. When your mind is pushed to the absolute breaking point, survival instinct takes over. The turning point didn't happen with a grand revelation. It happened during a rare, heavily guarded moment of exercise. The jailer, a grim, humorless brute named Lorenzo, occasionally allowed Casanova out of his cramped cell to walk briefly in the dusty, neglected garret, a dumping ground for the palace's forgotten junk, located just outside the cell block. Lorenzo would lock the outer door of the garret and leave Casanova alone for a few precious minutes. To Lorenzo, this was just an attic full of broken furniture and trash. To Casanova, it was a gold mine. His eyes darted across the darkness, scanning the debris with the calculating gaze of a predator. He had to be quick. If Lorenzo caught him snooping, it would mean immediate solitary lockdown in absolute darkness, or worse. Deep in a pile of rusted metal and shattered wood, Casanova spotted two things that would change the course of his life. First, a small, jagged chunk of black marble. Second, hidden beneath a pile of old papers, a heavy, straight iron bolt. It was about the length of a man's forearm, thick, rusted, and completely useless. At least, that's what a normal person would think. Casanova didn't see a piece of scrap metal. He saw a key. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he snatched the bolt and the marble. He shoved them down his trousers just seconds before the heavy grinding of the iron lock signaled Lorenzo's return. The guard threw the cell door open, ordered him inside, and locked him down. Casanova sat in the pitch black, his hands trembling as he felt the cold, hard steel against his skin. He had secured the raw materials, but a blunt iron bolt couldn't get him out. He needed a tool, a weapon, something capable of chewing through solid wood and ancient masonry. What followed was one of the most grueling acts of sheer endurance in the history of prison escapes. Every night, when the rest of the palace went dead silent, Casanova went to work. He had no grindstone, no oil, no light. He only had that piece of rough black marble, a splash of water from his drinking jug, and the iron bolt. He began to grind the metal against the stone. Shk, shk, shk. The sound was agonizingly slow, a grating scrape that echoed off the wooden walls of his cell. To cover the noise, he had to time his grinding with the coughing fits of prisoners down the hall, or the howling wind battering the lead roof above. The physical toll was brutal. He rubbed his hands raw. His skin blistered, tore open, and bled onto the cold floor. The salt from his sweat stung the open wounds. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He worked in a frenzy of manic determination, grinding away the rust, shaving down the blunt end of the bolt, millimeter by agonizing millimeter. Weeks bled into months. The pain in his arms was a constant, searing fire. But slowly, out of the darkness, something lethal was taking shape. The blunt iron rod was transforming into a terrifyingly sharp, multi-sided pike, an improvised weapon so dangerous it could shatter rock and pierce solid oak. Every morning, before Lorenzo arrived to check the cell, the adrenaline would spike. Where do you hide a foot-long iron spike in an empty wooden box? A shakedown would mean the end of everything. Casanova found a loose floorboard in a dark corner of his cell, a tiny crevice just deep enough. He hid the pike, carefully sweeping dust and grime over the crack to mask it. He was living on a knife edge. The tension in that cell was suffocating. Every time Lorenzo's boots thumped down the corridor, Casanova's stomach dropped. He had to play the part of a broken man, feigning sickness and despair, keeping his eyes downcast while his blood pounded in his ears. Lorenzo would sneer, kick the bucket, and lock the door, oblivious to the fact that he was standing inches away from his own downfall. Casanova finally had his tool. Now he needed a target. He stared at the thick, wooden planks of the floor beneath his feet. He knew the layout of the palace. Directly beneath his cell was an empty office used by the Inquisition's clerks. If he could just carve a hole through the floorboards, a hole big enough for a man to slip through, he could drop down into the office, pick the lock on the door, and walk right out into the corridors of the Doge's palace before dawn. It was a suicidal plan. The floor was heavily reinforced, built to hold the immense weight of the prison. But Casanova wasn't looking at the impossible odds. He gripped the iron pike in his bleeding, calloused hands. The real work was about to begin, and the clock was ticking.
When you're digging your way out of a maximum security black site, there is no room for error. The margin between freedom and a slow, agonizing death is razor thin. Armed with his makeshift iron pike, Casanova didn't waste a second. He targeted the floor right beneath his bed, the darkest, least inspected corner of his miserable wooden box. His routine became a terrifying obsession. The moment Lorenzo the jailer slammed the heavy door shut and his footsteps faded down the stone corridor, Casanova dropped to his knees. He gripped the iron spike, his hands already heavily scarred and wrapped in torn rags, and began to gouge at the ancient oak planks. The physical labor was excruciating. The wood of the Piombi was old, hardened by centuries, and thick as a fortress wall. He had to splinter it away piece by tiny piece, using only brute force and a crude piece of sharpened metal. It wasn't just the sheer effort that was killing him, it was the noise. Every crack, every scrape sounded like an explosion in the dead silence of the cell block. He was sweating profusely, his breath ragged, constantly freezing in terror at every phantom sound from the hallway. Did the guard hear that? Are they coming back? But digging the hole was only half the battle. The real nightmare was the debris. What do you do with handfuls of shredded oak when your cell is inspected daily? Casanova couldn't just sweep it under the rug. He had to be methodical. He carefully collected every splinter, every ounce of sawdust, and hid it inside the lining of his clothes. When Lorenzo took him out for those brief moments in the attic, Casanova would discreetly dump the sawdust into the dark corners of the garret. It was a masterclass in deception, played out in the shadows right under the feds' noses. Weeks dragged on. The hole grew deeper. He pierced through the first layer of oak, only to hit a massive layer of thick rubble and plaster, the subflooring used for soundproofing. The dust choked him, filling his lungs and coating his sweat-drenched skin. But he kept digging. He was a man possessed. By late August, his bloody, blistered hands felt a change. The floor was giving way. He had dug down far enough to realize there was only one thin layer of ceiling plaster left between him and the Inquisition office below. One solid kick and he would drop into the room below. The plan was flawless. He set the date, the night before the feast of St. Augustine. The city would be distracted, the guards relaxed. He was going to break through, climb down, and vanish into the Venetian night. The tension was suffocating. He spent the entire day vibrating with adrenaline, his mind racing through every step of the escape. Tonight I walk out of here. But fate has a sickening sense of humor. Just hours before his planned break, the heavy iron lock on his cell door aggressively ground open. It was noon, an unscheduled visit. Lorenzo the jailer stood in the doorway, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Get up, Casanova," Lorenzo barked. "I have good news. You're being moved to a better cell. Bigger, more light." For a split second, Casanova's heart completely stopped. The blood drained from his face. This wasn't a reward. It was a death sentence. A larger cell meant nothing. It meant leaving the hole he had spent months clawing out of the earth with his bare hands. It meant his escape route was destroyed. But worse, infinitely worse, it meant Lorenzo was about to discover the gaping hole under the bed. Panic seized Casanova's throat, but he couldn't show it. The true crime rule of survival is to never let the predator see your fear. He masked his absolute devastation with forced gratitude, quickly shoving the iron spike into his jacket. He was rushed down the hall into his new cell, a slightly larger room, yes, but with a floor made of solid stone and walls reinforced with thick iron bars. It was a vault, unbreakable. Sitting in the new cell, the agonizing wait began. He knew what was coming. He waited for the shouting. He waited for the heavy boots of the guards running down the hall. And then he heard it. Lorenzo's furious, earth-shattering roar echoed through the stone corridor. The jailer had gone back to clean the old cell and found the shredded floorboards. The feds had been played. Minutes later, the door to Casanova's new cell violently swung open. Lorenzo burst in, his face purple with rage, demanding to know who had smuggled in the tools, demanding the names of the accomplices. He tore the cell apart, screaming threats of torture and the gallows. Casanova, employing the cold, calculated manipulation of a sociopath, played innocent. He claimed Lorenzo himself must have given him the tools, subtly implying that if Lorenzo reported the whole to the Council of Ten, the Inquisitors would execute Lorenzo for incompetence. The psychological warfare worked. Lorenzo, terrified of the state's brutal punishment for his own negligence, kept his mouth shut. He didn't report the whole. But his revenge was immediate and crushing. From that moment on, Casanova was subjected to daily, aggressive shakedowns. The guards tapped the walls, scoured the floor, and watched his every move. Casanova was trapped in a stone vault, heavily monitored, with no way out. The floor was too hard to dig. His plan was dead. The odds were officially 0. Most men would have surrendered right there, broken by the crushing weight of the failure. But Giacomo Casanova gripped the hidden iron spike in his pocket. He wasn't done. If he couldn't dig his way out from the inside, he would have to find someone to dig him out from the outside.
When you're locked in a stone vault with the feds breathing down your neck, brute force won't save you. You need leverage. You need an angle. And most importantly, you need a partner. But how do you recruit an accomplice when you are completely isolated in solitary confinement? Casanova began to methodically inspect his new, supposedly inescapable cell. The walls were thick, reinforced with iron bars, and the floor was solid, unforgiving stone. Digging out was physically impossible. But his obsessive search revealed a flaw in the system. High up on one of the walls, right near the ceiling, there was a tiny, jagged crack in the masonry. It wasn't a way out, but it was a way through. He waited until the dead of night, pressed his face against the cold stone, and whispered into the crack. To his absolute shock, a voice whispered back. It was the inmate in the adjoining cell. His name was Father Marino Balbi, a disgraced monk locked up by the Inquisition for fathering an illegitimate child. Balbi was desperate, terrified, and slowly losing his mind in the dark. He was the perfect mark. Casanova immediately took control of the situation. He began communicating with Balbi through the crack, whispering a master plan that sounded like absolute lunacy. Since Casanova couldn't dig his way out, the plan was simple. Balbi would dig. The monk would break through his own ceiling, climb into the pitch-black attic space directly above the cells, crawl over to the space above Casanova's cell, and smash a hole through the ceiling to pull Casanova out. It was a brilliant, inverted escape plan. There was just one massive problem. Balbi didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a tool. All the monk had were his bare hands. Casanova had the iron pike, the lethal, sharpened weapon capable of chewing through the palace's ancient wood and plaster.
The question that would haunt the Venetian authorities for decades was this: how do you transfer a massive, foot-long iron spike from a heavily guarded, maximum security cell into another heavily guarded cell, while being constantly searched by a paranoid jailer? This is where Casanova pulled off one of the most audacious, heart-stopping cons in the history of prison escapes. He didn't try to sneak the spike past Lorenzo the jailer. He made Lorenzo carry it for him. Casanova convinced Lorenzo that he wanted to lend a large, heavy book, an oversized Bible, to the prisoner next door. Lorenzo, unaware of the secret communication between the two men, sneered but agreed to play messenger, provided he could thoroughly inspect the book first. Here's the setup. The iron spike was too long to fit completely inside the spine of the Bible. A good 2 inches of sharp metal stuck out the top. If Lorenzo just glanced at the book, the gig was up. Casanova would swing from a rope. Casanova needed a distraction. something so overwhelmingly demanding of Lorenzo's attention that he wouldn't even look at the book. He requested to buy a massive plate of hot, freshly cooked macaroni, dripping with thick, greasy butter and oil. He told Lorenzo he wanted to gift this hot meal to Balbi to celebrate a holy day. When Lorenzo arrived to pick up the items, the tension in the cell was thick enough to cut with a knife. Casanova's heart was thumping against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of polite indifference. He placed the oversized Bible flat on a large wooden tray. He had carefully wedged the deadly iron spike into the spine, letting the protruding end stick out toward the back. Then, he placed the heavy, scalding hot dish of greasy macaroni squarely on top of the Bible, right over the protruding metal. He handed the tray to Lorenzo. The moment of truth. If Lorenzo lifted the plate, he would see the metal. If he tilted the tray, the spike would slide out and clatter onto the stone floor. It was a terrifying gamble. But Casanova knew his mark. Lorenzo was terrified of spilling the hot, messy oil on the pristine book or on his own uniform. He gripped the tray with both hands, his eyes locked intensely on the sloshing grease of the macaroni. He didn't look at the Bible. He didn't check the spine. Sweating and cursing under his breath to keep the tray perfectly level, Lorenzo slowly turned and walked out of the cell. Casanova stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. He listened to the heavy boots walk down the corridor. He heard the lock turn on Balbi's door. He heard Lorenzo gruffly deliver the food and the book. And then, the door slammed shut. It worked. The weapon was in Balbi's hands. The monk found the spike hidden beneath the pasta dish and immediately tapped a frantic, confirming rhythm against the wall. The execution of the plan was now entirely in the hands of a terrified, inexperienced monk. For the next 3 weeks, Casanova endured a psychological torture worse than the isolation. Every day, he sat in his cell and listened to the faint, terrifying scrape, scrape, scrape of Balbi digging through his own ceiling, and then, slowly, agonizingly, crawling through the rat-infested attic space above. Every time Lorenzo entered Casanova's cell, Casanova held his breath, praying that Balbi wouldn't drop a piece of plaster or make a sound. If a guard looked up, they were dead. The tension was a tightrope, and it was about to snap. Halloween was approaching, the night of shadows, and Casanova was about to make his move. There is a specific kind of dread that comes from waiting for someone else to hold your life in their hands. For weeks, Casanova lived in a state of suspended terror. He had orchestrated the brilliant transfer of the iron spike, but now he was utterly powerless. He sat in his stone cell, staring up at the thick wooden planks of the ceiling, listening. Every faint thud, every muffled scrape of metal against wood, echoing from the attic above, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight to his heart. He was essentially waiting for the ceiling to collapse. But the real nightmare was the unpredictability of the feds. The Inquisition's guards, led by the increasingly paranoid Lorenzo, were erratic. They could burst into the cell at any moment. If Lorenzo walked in while Balbi was directly above them, hammering at the plaster, it was over. Casanova would be sent to the pozzi, the lower dungeons, flooded with seawater, where men were chained to the walls until they drowned or went mad. To mask the sound of Balbi's digging, Casanova threw violent theatrical fits. Whenever he sensed Lorenzo approaching, he would violently cough, kick his bed frame, or scream in feigned agony, covering the noise from above. It was a high-stakes, nerve-shredding performance. One slip, one quiet moment at the wrong time, and the executioner's axe would fall. Finally, the grueling wait came to an end. It was October 31st, 1756, a date that modern true crime junkies recognize as Halloween. The night the veil between the living and the dead is supposed to be at its thinnest. For Casanova, it was the night he either became a ghost or a free man. The palace was restless that evening. The wind off the Adriatic Sea was howling, violently battering the massive lead plates of the Piombi roof. The deafening roar of the storm was the perfect cover. Around midnight, a massive crack echoed through the cell. Dust and shards of ancient plaster rained down on Casanova's face. He looked up, his heart pounding in his throat. A hole had burst open in the ceiling, revealing the terrified, soot-covered face of Father Balbi, clutching the bloody iron spike. "I'm through!" Balbi gasped. There was no time to celebrate. The clock was ticking, and the guards made rounds at unpredictable intervals. Casanova didn't hesitate. He knew that getting out of the cell was just step one. They still had to survive the descent from the roof. He tore his bedsheets into long, thick strips, knotting them together with frantic, desperate strength to create a makeshift rope, nearly 100 feet long. He wrapped the coiled rope around his shoulders, grabbed his silk coat, the only piece of clothing he had from the night of his arrest, and pulled himself up through the jagged hole. He hoisted himself into the attic. The space was a pitch-black nightmare. It was a suffocating, dusty crawl space directly beneath the heavy lead plates of the roof, infested with rats and thick with centuries of cobwebs. The noise of the storm up here was deafening. The wind screamed through the cracks, a brutal reminder of the deadly elements waiting outside. Balbi was trembling violently, practically hyperventilating. He was a monk, not a hardened criminal, and the reality of their situation was crushing him. "We can't do this," Balbi stammered in the dark. "The gods will kill us." Casanova grabbed him by the collar, his voice a lethal, commanding whisper. "You are not turning back. We die here or we die outside, but we are not staying." Casanova took the lead. He snatched the iron spike back from Balbi and crawled toward the slanted edge of the roof. Above them were the heavy lead plates, the very material that gave the prison its terrifying name. These weren't shingles. They were massive, interlocking slabs of metal, baking in the summer and freezing in the winter, designed to be impenetrable. Casanova wedged the sharp end of the iron spike under the edge of one of the plates. He braced his boots against a wooden beam, gritted his teeth, and pushed with every ounce of strength left in his emaciated body. The muscles in his back screamed in protest. His blistered hands tore open again, slicking the iron with fresh blood. He strained until he thought his spine would snap. With a sickening metallic screech, the lead plate groaned and lifted. A blast of freezing, salt-laced wind ripped into the attic, nearly knocking them backward. Casanova shoved the heavy slab aside, creating a gap just barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He pulled himself up, thrusting his head and shoulders out into the violent Venetian night. The storm was ferocious. The fog was thick, swirling around the massive domes and spires of the Doge's palace. He looked down and felt his stomach bottom out. Below him was a sheer, terrifying drop into the black waters of the canal and the unforgiving cobblestones of St. Mark's Square. They were out of the cell, but they were now standing on the deadliest surface in Venice. One wrong step on the slick, steep roof, and they would plummet to a gruesome, shattered death. The real escape hadn't even begun. Stepping out onto the roof of the Doge's palace in the dead of night, in the middle of a howling storm, is not freedom. It's a death wish. Casanova dragged himself through the narrow gap, his clothes catching on the jagged edges of the heavy lead plates. The moment he was fully exposed to the elements, the sheer violence of the wind nearly tore him right off the roof. He flattened his body against the steep incline, gasping for air as the freezing rain and sea mist battered his face. Behind him, Father Balbi poked his head out of the hole, took one look at the terrifying drop into the abyss, and froze in absolute terror. The monk was paralyzed. Casanova had to reach back, grab Balbi by the collar, and physically drag him out onto the roof, hissing brutal threats to keep him quiet. They were now exposed, clinging to the side of a massive, sloped roof made entirely of smooth lead plates. It was past midnight. The city of Venice lay sprawling below them, cloaked in an impenetrable, swirling fog. The drop was horrifying. Hundreds of feet straight down onto the marble pavement of the courtyard, or the freezing, black waters of the canal. There were no handholds, no safety nets, just wet metal and gravity. Casanova knew they couldn't stay where they were. If the guards made their rounds and found the empty cells, the alarm would sound, and soldiers would swarm the rooftops. They had to move. He gripped his improvised iron spike, the only tool keeping them alive, and began to crawl along the ridge of the roof. It was a slow, agonizing crawl. The lead was slick with sea mist and rain. Every movement was a terrifying calculation. Slide the spike into a seam. Test the grip. Pull. Drag your body up an inch. Pray you don't slip. Balbi followed behind, whimpering, clutching onto Casanova's coat like a terrified child. Then came the moment that stops the heart of anyone who hears this story. The heart-pounding, terrifying what if. They were crawling near the very edge of the roof, trying to bypass a massive, slippery dome. Casanova reached forward to plant his spike, but the metal slipped on a patch of wet moss. His boot lost its grip on the sheer incline. Instantly, he was sliding backward. The rough lead tore at his clothes and skin as he plummeted toward the edge. In a fraction of a second, his legs slid off the roof. His waist slid off. He was plunging into the void. At the absolute last possible millisecond, his elbows caught the gutter, a thick rim of stone at the edge of the roof. The violent jolt nearly ripped his arms out of their sockets. He was hanging, suspended over the black abyss of Venice, hundreds of feet in the air. His boots kicked at the empty darkness below. His muscles screamed in pure agony, tearing under his own body weight. Blood pounded in his ears, deafeningly loud against the howling wind. Above him, on the roof, Balbi let out a stifled, pathetic cry, absolutely useless to help. Casanova looked down into the fog. A fall from this height wouldn't just kill him. It would shatter him into pieces on the courtyard stones below. This was it. The feds didn't even have to execute him. The palace itself was doing the job. But Giacomo Casanova refused to die. A primal surge of adrenaline flooded his system. Gritting his teeth until he tasted blood, he locked his jaw, engaged every single muscle in his shattered upper body, and hauled himself upward. Inch by torturous inch, he scraped his chest against the rough stone of the gutter, throwing his weight forward until he collapsed back onto the safety of the roof, gasping violently for air. He lay there for a moment, his heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against his ribs. He had survived the fall, but they were still trapped on the roof.
He forced himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his torn muscles, and scanned the treacherous landscape of the palace roof. Through the gloom, he spotted something that made his pulse spike again. A dormer window. A small, arched window built into the slope of the roof, leading back down into a different section of the palace. He crawled toward it, dragging the terrified monk behind him. When they reached the window, Casanova's brief spark of hope was immediately crushed. It was heavily barred with thick iron grating, and behind the grating, the glass was locked tight. They were exposed on the roof. The wind was freezing their sweat into ice. Dawn was only hours away. If the sun rose while they were up here, they would be spotted by 100 guards and shot dead on the lead plates. Casanova gripped his bloody iron spike. He didn't come this far to freeze to death on a rooftop. He wedged the heavy iron rod between the window frame and the bars. He braced his boots against the slippery roof, leaned back, and used his body weight as a lever. He pulled with a manic, desperate fury. Creak! The ancient, rusted iron grating groaned, bent, and finally snapped off the frame with a loud, metallic clang. Casanova didn't hesitate. He smashed the heavy spike right through the glass pane, shattering it into pieces. He cleared the jagged shards from the frame, threw his makeshift rope of bedsheets inside, and lowered himself into the gaping, black void of the unknown palace room below. They were off the roof, but they had just broken into the very heart of the Venetian government, a sprawling, heavily guarded labyrinth filled with the very men who wanted them dead. The final, psychological game was about to begin. They dropped into absolute, suffocating darkness. Casanova and Balbi hit the wooden floor of the room, surrounded by the smell of ancient paper and dust. They had broken into the ducal chancery, the sprawling archive room of the Doge's palace. It was a massive vault containing the Republic's most highly classified state secrets. Casanova lay on the floor, his chest heaving, his body completely shattered. He was covered in blood, sweat, and soot. His clothes were torn to shreds, his hands raw meat. Beside him, Father Balbi was weeping silently in the dark. They had survived the roof, but they were now trapped inside a fortress. The doors of the chancery were locked from the outside, with massive, heavy iron bolts. Casanova dragged himself to the main door and furiously worked at the lock with his bloody spike. But this wasn't a cheap wooden door. It was heavily reinforced solid oak, designed to protect state secrets. His spike just uselessly chipped the wood. They were stuck. The adrenaline crashed, leaving Casanova exhausted to the bone. He slumped against the wall in the dark. There was only one terrible option left. They had to wait for dawn. They had to wait for a guard or a clerk to open the door from the outside. And then they had to somehow bluff their way out of the most heavily guarded building in the Venetian Republic. It was a suicidal play. Two filthy, bloody prisoners trying to walk out the front door. As the faint gray light of dawn began to creep through the shattered dormer window, Casanova knew he had to weaponize the only thing he had left. He didn't have weapons. He didn't have a crew. He had his mind. He had to become the ultimate confidence man. He reached into the bundle he had dragged across the roof and pulled out the extravagant silk coat and fine breeches he was wearing on the night he was arrested a year and a half ago. They were wrinkled, slightly torn, but they still screamed money and power. He wiped the dried blood from his face, aggressively slicked back his tangled hair, and forced his battered body to stand perfectly straight. He looked at Balbi, who was a trembling, pathetic mess.
"Do exactly as I say," Casanova hissed, his voice cold and commanding. "Keep your mouth shut, keep your eyes down, and stay behind me." At exactly 6 a.m., the heavy grinding of a key turning in the main lock echoed like a gunshot in the silent archive room. The heavy oak door swung open. A solitary palace guard, carrying a ring of massive keys, stepped into the room. He froze, his jaw dropping in absolute shock at the sight of two men standing in the high-security archive. This was the critical, heart-stopping moment. If the guard yelled, if he drew his weapon, the palace would swarm, and Casanova would swing from a rope before noon. Casanova didn't flinch. He didn't run. He leaned into his aristocratic arrogance, channeling the furious, impatient energy of a powerful government official who had been terribly inconvenienced. Before the guard could even open his mouth to shout, Casanova stepped forward, his eyes burning with manufactured rage. He fixed his torn silk coat, looked down his nose at the guard, and barked in a tone of absolute, commanding authority. "It is about time!" Casanova snapped, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I am an official of the court. I was accidentally locked in this miserable archive room last night after the council meeting. I have been freezing here for hours. Unlock the main doors immediately so I may go home." The guard was completely paralyzed. He stared at Casanova's fine silk clothing, his commanding posture, and the sheer, overwhelming confidence radiating from him. The guard's brain short-circuited. He couldn't compute that a prisoner from the inescapable Piombi could possibly be standing in the state archives demanding to be let out. He assumed exactly what Casanova wanted him to assume, that this was an angry nobleman he had stupidly locked in by mistake. Terrified of angering a powerful aristocrat, the guard aggressively bowed his head, mumbled an apology, and stepped aside. Casanova strode past him, his heart pounding a violent, deafening rhythm in his chest. Balbi scurried silently behind him. They walked out of the archive and onto the Scala d'Oro, the magnificent, sweeping, golden staircase of the Doge's palace. They were descending right through the heart of the government. Guards were standing at checkpoints. Servants were beginning their morning routines. The absolute terror of being recognized threatened to crush Casanova's lungs, but he kept his head high, his pace brisk, his face a mask of annoyed superiority. He was playing the role of his life. They reached the massive front doors of the palace, the final barrier. Another guard hurriedly unlocked it, holding it open for the angry nobleman. Casanova stepped through the doorway. The cool morning air of St. Mark's Square hit his face. The sky was pale blue. The storm had broken. He was standing in the open plaza, entirely free. He didn't run. Running invites a chase. He walked briskly to the edge of the Grand Canal, flagged down a passing gondolier with absolute authority, and ordered the man to row them toward the mainland. As the gondola slipped silently away into the morning mist, Casanova looked back at the towering roof of the Doge's palace, specifically at the heavy lead plates glinting in the rising sun. By the time Lorenzo the jailer opened the door to the empty cell and found the massive hole in the ceiling, Casanova was miles away, vanishing into the pages of history. The Venetian authorities were completely baffled. The sheer psychological audacity, the impossible physical endurance, and the ultimate, flawless bluff left the state embarrassed and terrified. They had built an inescapable prison, and one man had beaten it with a piece of scrap metal and sheer force of will. The Breakout of 1756 remains a masterclass in survival, manipulation,
and the unbreakable human spirit. It's an escape so flawless, it makes modern feds look like amateurs. If you made it to the end of this terrifying journey and your heart is still racing, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let me know in the comments. Could you have made that crawl across the icy roof of the Piombi? Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next deep dive into the darkest corners of history.